Let me begin with a little bit of background on myself. I went to college at the University of Montana in Missoula. My botany professor was a fire ecologist, so it didn't matter what class you took from him, you know, whether it was introduction to biology or whatever else, we always got lots of fires. And that's sort of my first introduction to thinking somewhat differently about wildfires. It's not. There's always technical. Is this better?
Yes, it is.
Much better. So anyway,
You got to turn it on. But even just
some pivotal events. And after that was eventually I moved to Livingston, Montana, which is just north of Yellowstone Park. And I was there in 1988 when the large wildfires burned across Yellowstone. And that was a real eye-opener to me for reasons that may not be obvious immediately. But over the years, I worked as a freelance writer and photographer. I published 38 books at this point. But I traveled around all over the United States in researching these books, and I was always interested in what fire issues were in every ecosystem I visited. And so that led eventually to a book, put the first slide up on there, Wildfire, A Century of Failed Forest Policy. And this was a big coffee table book. And the purpose of the book was to put a more positive view of wildfire. It's not coming up, is it?
no. There you go. Oh, no.
That's not it?
Keep going.
Okay.
More.
There it is. There's the cover. And so that book has a lot of pictures of things like flowery meadows and places that were burnt at the time in the past, but trying to convey the beauty of the bird forest. Next slide. So I want to try to convince you of a different paradigm, that wildfire creates a beautiful landscape and is very important ecologically in what it does. And we have this whole paradigm. We always think that the fire, we use terms all the time in the media, the fire destroyed so many acres or devastated the landscape. But what you'll find is that wildfire is a very important ecological process, among others, that from an evolutionary perspective has shaped many ecosystems, particularly in the West. And a lot of my talk is about the West. Not everything I say will apply to the East, but a lot of the same principles will be there. I have to say next slide now. I don't good job. So I like this one. This is from a Robinson Jeffers poem, but with the wolf's tooth whittled so fine, the fleet limbs of the antelope. The idea being that these are evolutionary processes that shape ecosystems. And the beautiful results afterwards, that's the second picture there. Next picture. So we have this whole dynamic because of our human bias of good fire versus bad fire. I hear it all the time, particularly in the West. I don't know what you say here. But the idea is that the predominant view is that some fire is okay so long as it doesn't kill too many trees or wildlife or whatever. But that's our perspective on things. And of course, if a fire burns your house down or your town, that's not a good thing. But from an ecological point of view, the fire is not necessarily bad. Now, next slide. I'm going to use a few terms, and I want people to understand the terms. There's a definition called fire severity. And you get everything from the top of that picture there, shows where all the trees are killed in that area. That would be a high severity fire. And then mixed severity is a percentage, 25 to 75% of the trees could be killed. And low severity means majority. Majority of the fires survive. Majority of trees survive. So I'll use those terms throughout, but just keep them in mind as I go forward. Next picture. So we are having an increase in fires. But what we're seeing is the result of climate, which is being changed by human carbon emissions. But still, climate is the driving force in wildfires. And it affects, along with other things, what plants you're talking about, the topography and some other variables, what kinds of fires you get, whether you have a large fire or not, a small fire and so forth. So next picture. So what we have across the globe right now is 20% of the burnable land area is now departed from its historic conditions. Now, understand that historic is defined as the most recent history, the last couple hundred years. And if you go back, I'll have a slide in a second here, we've had various conditions in the past that actually mimic what we're seeing today. So let's go to the next slide. And what we see, and I call what's called a shifting baseline, when you listen to the media and a lot of advocates of a lot of manipulation of forests, they say fires are worse today than they were in the 1970s. And worse in terms of, they're using that definition in sense of more widespread and more high severity fire that kills a lot of trees. But if you were to go back in time just a little bit in the 1900s, you'll find that at the early part of the century, there was a lot of large wildfires. One of the best known is the 1910 wildfire that burned 3 to 3.5 million acres of northern Idaho and western Montana. There has not been a single fire since then that large in the United States. And that was before there was fire suppression or any of the other factors. But it was drought conditions that year, along with a few other factors like high wind. Next picture. So where you start and how you count things makes a difference. So this one shows how much climate affects things. The red at the beginning there shows how many acres burned, and you can see that there's a part in the middle where the blue is, where there was not very many acres burned. But it was also a time when the western United States was cooler and moister than today. And showing how much the climate does influence wildfires. In 1929, a little thing was happening at that time called the Dust Bowl. We had almost 50 million acres burned across the West. Today, at 10 million acres burned, let me give you a reference point. Vermont is 6 million acres. So if 10 million acres, more than the size of Vermont, were to burn in a season, we call that a huge fire season. But 50 million acres, what's a comparable thing? Well, Maine is 20 million acres, so more than 2.5 times the size of Maine, burned in 1929. So just to see how this is affected by ocean currents offshore that often last decades that influence climate. Next picture. At that time, contrary to what's happening now, glaciers were growing in the West. When I started school at the University of Montana, including in that botany class with my fire ecologist botanist, we were talking about how the ice age was going to come down, glaciers were coming down from Canada, and how we're going to feed everybody when the cornfields in Iowa get covered with ice. And that was the worry in the early 1970s and 80s. And then what happened is by the late 1980s, so much carbon had been put into the atmosphere, it started to change the overall weather and climate. But we've had these variations, and this is what you hear from some people, that climate change is a hoax. It's not a hoax. But we have had variation in the past, and there's a correlation that can be shown between periods of warmer, drier conditions and large acreages of fire occurring on the landscape, and cooler and moister times, less fire on the landscape. Next picture. So for example, there was a little thing called the medieval warm spell between about 800 and 1300 AD. And during that time, that's when the Anasazi natives in the Four Corners area abandoned their cliff dwellings. because it got too dry. They had to go to the Rio Grande where they had permanent water. It was also the same time when Greenland was colonized, and Greenland was warmer and greener then. And that was during one of these warm spells. And then the climate change, we had the Little Ice Age came along, you know, and so forth. So we have this natural climate variation. Another important point is most fires remain small and go out without any suppression. We just take credit for it. And here's a study that was done in the West. Next slide, please. One more. Forget the comment, go ahead. Okay, there was, this was done in Yellowstone Park between 1972 and 1987. And 88 was the year of the big fires. There were 235 fires in the backcountry. 222 of them burned 5 acres or less with no suppression. They all went out. And even the larger ones, the few larger ones, more than 5 acres, all went out without any kind of suppression. And that's an important point because most fires, actually if you don't do anything, will go out on their own. Next slide. Another thing to look at is how much do they burn? Most fires don't amount to anything. This is another study that looked at 56,320 fires that burned 9 million acres in the Rocky Mountains between 1980 and 2003. And most of these fires burned an acre or less. 98% of the fires accounted for 4% of the area burned. So the vast majority of those fires didn't burn anything. And next slide. However, 2% of all the fires accounted for 96% of the acreage burned. So in other words, a very few amount of fires burn the majority of acreage. And of those 50 fires, 0.1% were responsible for half of the acreage charged. And this happens every summer. We get this distorted view of wildfire because we get these named wildfires that are very large, and everybody gets the impression, you know, the whole world is burning down, when most fires don't amount to anything and are fairly insignificant. And this is another important point. From an ecological point of view, the ecological and evolutionary work is largely done by the few large wildfires. In other words, you could have a fire, the Dixie Fire, I'll use that one, in 2021, it burned almost 1 million acres in California. And that fire, you know, does more work. You'd have to have, how many fires would you have to have of 1 or 2 acres to equal that one Dixie Fire in terms of the landscape affected? So keep that in mind. Even if we could put out all these fires, I would argue that we shouldn't, because there are ecological and evolutionary reasons for having wildfire in the landscape. All right, next slide. Let's see, what do we got here? Now, a lot of the fire management, at least in the West, is on the assumption that we want to prevent large wildfires. The problem is that when you have extreme fire weather, which I'll define in a little bit, it doesn't work. In other words, all those large fires I mentioned, that 0.1% of fires burn during what's called extreme fire weather conditions. And when you have those extreme fire weather conditions, you don't stop fires. And if you're a firefighter, you get out of the way until the weather changes, and then maybe you can do something about it. But so this picture is a bunch of clear cuts on a national forest out west, and you can see the fire burned all around it. If fuel reductions was going to do something to slow down fires, it would have stopped. I'll go into this in a little bit more detail in a bit. But one of the assertions is that fire suppression has led to higher fuel loadings and responsible for these large fires. And this is based on what's called fire scar studies. And there's a lot of problems with fire scar studies methodologically. And I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but I want you to just come away with the idea that, the next slide please, that fire scars studies have methodological problems that distort the story. And next slide. There are, next slide after this please. There are a bunch of other ways to determine fire history. Almost all of them come up with a different scenario or history of what's going on or what has happened than the fire scar studies. But fire scar studies dominate most fire research, particularly almost everybody got a PhD in the 1970s and 80s and 90s in fire ecology, did it by doing fire scar studies. So that sort of dominates what's out there. But I'll just give you one example of one of the ones that are different, because I participated in this. The Government Land Office reports, GLO reports. One of the ways to determine past fire history is to go over old surveys that were done back when the land was first being settled so they could determine property lines. So for example, in Oregon, the first government land surveys were done in the 1860s. That was before there was any settlement, before there was any logging, when there was still plenty of Native American burning going on and so forth. And what the surveyors did is they traveled across the land. They have a straight line they're shooting. And I was a surveyor in Alaska. This is my party chief here up on the Kobuk River in Alaska. But what you do is you record the vegetation that you're traveling across on this transect. So that, you know, if you come across a burnt forest, you mentioned we traveled a half a mile through the burnt forest, and now we're in old growth spruce forest or whatever. And so what some of the researchers do is they go back and they find these old surveys and they do the same transect. In other words, they run the same line that was run in 1860 or whatever, and they take a look at the forest and say, how does that match up with what was said in 1860? And so you don't have to guess what the vegetation is like. It's right there recorded. And they do the transect to verify that it was accurate, and that's the point. Anyway, I've done resurvey. I've done original surveys, but I did a resurvey of one of these lines across Montana once. It was really interesting. This was, you know, the survey was done like in 1880 or something like that. And it was amazing how accurate it was in the old surveys. We find all the corners that they had put out there within a foot usually, which was pretty amazing given the times and surveys. Anyway, there's lots of other ways to determine what was out there. Sediment studies, charcoal studies, pollen studies, etc. All right, so keep that in mind, other methods. And now, next slide. What you need for a big fire, this is extreme fire conditions. You need drought. Usually, low humidity, high temperatures, but wind is this really big secret in this cocktail. And when you have wind, it's very difficult to stop a fire, particularly high winds. And I use this point of, you know, you can have gasoline in your car, that's like fuel, right? But it won't go anywhere unless you have ignition, unless you know, shift the gears and do all this stuff. And that's the same thing with wildfire. So you can have a lot of fuel, next picture, and it won't necessarily develop into a large fire. A recent study found that 90% of acres burned occurred during periods of very strong winds. So wind is the common factor. Next picture. And so long as these coincide with heat, fuel, aridity, and extreme winds, you get these sparks coming and blowing in embers, and that blows beyond any kind of treatment you might have, whether you do forest thinning, whether you do prescribed burning, or whatever, you're going to have a fire going. And you have to understand that fire spread is not linear, it's exponential. So that a 20-mile-an-hour fire is going to spread embers much faster and farther than one that's burning at a 10-mile-an-hour wind or whatever. And then you look at things like the fires that they're having in California, like they had this winter, 100-mile-an-hour Santa Ana winds. You think you're going to stop anything when it's blowing embers like that? Never. So the wind-driven fires blow the fires ahead and start other fires, and we call it spotting, but you can see in this picture I took near Yellowstone during 1988 with the spotting ahead. And that's why things like thinning and prescribed burning will not work effectively under extreme fire conditions. And if fuels drove large wildfires, the largest wildfires we'd have would be in places like the Oregon Coast Range. But we don't have big fires there. Why? Because it is, next picture, another picture, please. We don't have big fires here because it's moist and cool. And so if it's moist and cool, you won't get large fires. So next picture. The main thing that's done today, and remember, this is trying to stop the large fires, is logging and prescribed burns. And logging called thinning. Next picture. So I want to show you something here. This was a fire that burned in 2020 in Oregon along the Mackenzie River. And this shows you the fire severity. Green means it hardly burned at all. Red, it burned with high severity. Yellow is sort of mixed severity fire. And you see the arrow I have there pointing to the reservoir in the corner. Okay, next picture. This is a Google Earth. The arrow is pointing at the same reservoir. All right, go back to the picture before. And notice in the eastern north corner, the eastern right-hand corner, it's real green. Go back to the Google Earth. There's no logging there. Then, where is all the logging? Go back to the picture again. That's where the high severity fires are occurring. And so why is this? Because logging often enhances fire spread. Because think of the conditions again that big fires burn. You open up the forest canopy, you have more sunlight, which dries out the vegetation and the soils, so you get a bigger vapor deficit. You have more wind penetration when there's, you know yourself, you get behind a real dense forest. Trees, the wind can't hardly touch you, and then you go out where it's real thin, and it spreads the fire. Okay, next picture, go past the Google Earth, go past the next one. Okay, so this is a good example of a situation. I happened to take this photograph of a thin stand on the left in May of 2021. This is the Dixie Fire in California. I came back that fall, and this is as close as I could figure. It was exactly the same spot that I took the previous picture, and you can see that the stumps there are blackened. That means the fire passed over that. In other words, if they had been logged after the fire, the tops of the stumps would have been white. So this is what was thin, and you can see that it didn't stop the fire at all. It was a heck of a fire burn through all these areas. Next picture. Another example, the Thomas Fire in California. The only fuel treatment that stopped it was the Pacific Ocean. It didn't cross that. Next picture. We have the Eagle Fire, which burned in the Columbia Gorge there in Oregon, and that fire jumped across the Columbia River, a 1.5 mile wide river with no fuel. Again, wind blown. Next picture. So the majority of acreage burns on extreme conditions, and this is natural, not an aberration. Next picture. And there have been a lot of studies that you don't hear about too much, but that environmental conditions, when you have these extreme cases, they overwhelm most fuel treatments, and including prescribed burning and thinning. Next picture. And another conclusion, the same thing. Fuel treatments cannot realistically be expected to eliminate large areas burned in severe fire weather. Next picture. And even the Congressional Research Service did a study and found that there's a weak relationship between acres logged and the extent and severity of fires. Fewer areas burned in areas where logging was limited. Next picture. Then there was a study, which is a review study. Review study means they looked at a whole lot of studies and tried to draw conclusions. They looked at 1,500 fires across the country in ponderosa pine and mixed conifer, and they found that forests with higher levels of protection, in other words, no logging, they were primarily looking at national parks and wilderness areas, had lower fire severity values than areas that were actively managed, even though they had a lot of vegetation there. Again, making my point that that doesn't necessarily drive large fires. So we have this whole Southwest model that dominates the thinking about fires, and that is that you have frequent fires, and that kept fires from getting big. And that may apply some of the time to the Southwest ponderosa pine forest, but it doesn't apply, next picture, to the majority of vegetation, at least in the West. So almost every other plant community in the West doesn't have frequent fires. They have longer rotations naturally between the fires, often hundreds of years. And so, it's not unexpected to have some fuel build up, so to speak, or accumulate if your natural fire frequency is 200 years. And this even includes things like sagebrush and chaparral and so forth. Okay, next pictures. And this is another important point. In most years, non-forested areas burn more acres than the forested areas. So this whole focus on forests, at least in the West, doesn't make sense because the places that are burning up in a lot of cases are in other kinds of plant communities like chaparral, grassland, sagebrush, etc. Next picture. Okay, so now we have people that say we have to fix the forest, either through logging and prescribed burning. Human manipulation, in my view, is not needed. Ponderosa pine, which is a common species in the West that they say we have to fix by logging and thinning, has existed as a separate species for 55 million years. And humans only arrived in North America 15,000 years ago. So either ponderosa pine forests were a heck of a mess for all those millions of years that they didn't have humans here to fix them, or maybe they can survive on their own without humans messing around with them. And when you consider that's true of almost all the different, next picture, plant communities, at least in the West. One more picture, yeah. I like this this cartoon, Gary Lesenkamp. You can see the rings right here, Jimmy. That's another time when this old fellow's miraculously survived some big forest fire. But of course gets logged. That's what he didn't survive. And that's an interesting thing. I see all the time. There's among foresters and others, and I went to forestry school, by the way, so among foresters and so forth, they have this idea that the only mortality that's acceptable is chainsaw medicine to fix the forest. So if the forest trees are dying from insects, or drought, or wildfire, or whatever, that's not okay. We've got to fix the forest, and we go in there with chainsaws. And the irony is a recent study came out, found that if you combine the trees that are taken away through thinning with any mortality that might happen when you have a natural fire, you actually have more trees being killed. You know, but all those trees that are logged, nobody considers that killing the trees. Anyway, logging is not benign, so keep that in there. First, I'll show you. Go to the next picture, please. I'll sort of address these things that I have there. Okay, so this is a certified conservation sustainable forest in Northern California. And to me, it's a biologically impoverished site. This is an ecological mess of degraded forest. There's almost no dead wood on the ground, which in natural ecosystems you would have more of. There's almost no snags, which you would normally have. And so this is a sanitized forest. And it won't stop a fire either under extreme fire conditions. Next picture. So here's another one on the Deschutes National Forest. And again, the absence of downed trees and so forth. And it's like a monoculture. The trees that they left behind are almost all the age, same age, which you would not have under most natural conditions. Okay, next picture. And then something important is a loss of genetic diversity. We have no idea. I go out with the foresters all the time. I say, okay, point to me the trees here in this stand that you're going to log that are resistant to drought. And they kind of look at me like, blank stare, like, what are you talking about? So, some of these trees have a genetic resistance to drought, I'm sure of it. Some of them can survive better in cool weather. Which ones are they? And what you find is in natural forests, there's this diversity of genetics that if you go in and thin, you often can eliminate those genetic traits, particularly rare genetic traits, maybe 1 in 100 trees might have, that will be just the thing that will help it survive the next event. Because we don't know where we're going with this climate change and what factors will be beneficial in the long run. Another thing with logging is it contributes more emissions than wildfire. This is for Oregon, and the largest single source of carbon emissions in Oregon comes from logging. Now, the timber industry is pretty big in Oregon, but it's more than transportation. It's more than anything else that you normally think about. So it's the green you see in this chart here, and logging accounts for 35% of carbon emissions. And so you're going in there and you're logging to prevent wildfires, next picture, and what you're doing is actually increasing the climate warming conditions through emissions. The other reason is fuel reductions, prescribed burning or whatever, might work under low to moderate fire weather conditions. And so when you see studies that suggest that these are effective, they're not looking at the few extreme fire weather conditions and saying, is it, or they blend them in with all the other low and moderate things so that it masks the effect of extreme conditions. But it's insignificant. It's a watering can pond in a river. And another problem is that a lot of times in that picture you get these the plants that come back. I took these pictures outside of Bend, Oregon, where I live, and the picture on the left there is all this grassland. This grass is what's called a flashy fuel. In other words, it burns real easily, and it burns real fast. That same site before the burn, prescribed burn, had been bitterbrush, which is a shrub. It's also flammable, but not nearly as flammable as the grasses that replaced it. Next picture. So what they're doing there now is we're doing prescribed burns. And so we have smoke all in the fall and in the spring, and then maybe in the summer if there's wildfires, but a lot of times there isn't wildfires. Like this summer, there were only 2 days in Bend that the smoke was considered unhealthy. And the rest of the time was blue skies like this. And yet we had smoke in the spring and we had smoke in the fall with the prescribed burning. So I'm going to speed up one more thing. Skip this one, the next one. How do you define what's a healthy forest? Well, one of the interesting things is that the second highest biodiversity in forest ecosystems, at least in the West, after old growth forest, is the snag forest that results after a fire, stand replacement fire. So ecologically, if you care about biodiversity, it's important. Next slide. For example, forest species are worried about green forests. A lot of species depend on the dead trees. So if you're a species that depends on dead trees, you're afraid of green forests. Next picture. For example, birds in the West. 45% of the bird species depend on dead trees and down wood. Next picture. Even bats, people don't think about this, but they roost under the bark on dead trees. Next picture. One more, go ahead. After a high severity fire, we get more bees, higher bee density and diversity for a number of reasons. Next picture. And even fish. After a big fire, you get bigger fish and more fish in the streams because the logs that result create habitat for the fish. I mean, I could give you a whole lot of other examples, but the point being is that it's not a disaster to have a high severity fire. And so finally, we're in the next picture. What we have is, so what are you going to do to prevent fires from burning down your house? Well, you have to reduce the flammability of the home, the immediate area. Next picture. So here's a picture I took in the Waldo Canyon fire in Colorado. Look at the green trees all around the foundations here, and pavement all around it. So the fire did not burn into the houses. What happened was embers landed on the houses and burned the houses down. Next picture. And here's Paradise, California, same thing. Fires burned down the foundation. You got green trees all around. I've seen this over and over again around the West. And in fact, the vulnerability of the house largely determines whether your house will survive or not. So we should be treating the fuels immediately around the houses and the houses themselves to determine, next picture, whether they will survive a fire. So one more after this. Treat things, so you get things like clean the gutters, you metal roofs, screens on the vents, remove flammable materials like wood piles. A sprinkler on the roof will help. Next picture. These are cheap things. So there's a sprinkler on the roof. I bought 2 of these. It cost me $300 for my house. And last thing I'm going to do when I abandon my house is turn on the sprinkler. Maybe the house will be there when I get back. Anyway, next picture. So you start with the house and you work outwards rather than this idea that we have to sort of sanitize the forest all around. And it really does work. Fires will not ignite wooden walls at a greater distance than 130 feet away. So you don't have to do much beyond that distance to fireproof your house. And you have to think outside the box. I remember reading about one fire down in LA Basin where 50 houses burned down, and they looked at what was characteristic and the neighbors didn't. That was, the next picture, doggy doors. And doggy doors are made to swing open, right? High severity fires happen when there's a lot of wind. So the embers got blown into the houses that had doggy doors, and the ones that didn't survived the fire. So, just that kind of thing. So, last slide. Ultimately, we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and carbon. But in the meanwhile, keep in mind that climate weather drives large fires. Fuel reductions have limited value under extreme fire conditions. Another important point is the probability that a large fire will encounter a fuel reduction is very low, usually less than 1%. So you get all the negatives from doing the manipulation, and you don't get much benefit from it. It's an important point. Next picture. Wildfires and other natural events improve and invigorate ecosystems. I'm trying to change the paradigm here, how you think about them, right? And large fires provide the bulk of dead tree recruitment in forest ecosystems. And the way to protect communities is to reduce the flammability and prevent, Zoki and prevent fire and the fire plane. And we have to we have to create habitat for forest elves. It's a very important reason for having large wildfires. Okay, that's it. Thank you.